The hammer fell in perfect rhythm against the glowing horseshoe, each strike sending orange sparks dancing through the dim interior of the forge. Samuel Hartwell worked with the measured patience of a man who had long ago made peace with time, his weathered hands guiding the red-hot iron with practiced ease. At 68, his shoulders still carried the width of his younger years, though they now bore a slight stoop that spoke of decades spent leaning over anvil and flame. Gray hair, more silver than black, escaped from beneath his leather cap, and his beard held the same winter coloring that marked him as one of Iron Creek's elder craftsmen. The mountain town of Iron Creek nestled in a valley where the morning mist clung to pine-covered slopes, and the sound of Samuel's hammer had become as familiar as church bells. His forge sat at the heart of the settlement, a stone and timber building that had served the community for nearly 15 years since he had arrived with little more than his tools and a quiet determination to leave his past undisturbed. The townspeople knew him as a man of few words and steady work, someone who asked no questions about their business and expected the same courtesy in return. Young Tommy Peterson, barely 16 and eager as a hound pup, pumped the bellows with enthusiasm that made Samuel remember his own apprentice days in what felt like another lifetime. The boy had been working for him for 3 years now, learning the ancient dance between fire and metal that turned raw iron into the tools that built civilization. Tommy's mother had died the previous winter, and his father worked the copper mine on the far side of the mountain, leaving the boy to earn his keep and learn a trade that would serve him well wherever life might carry him. The morning had started like any other, with Samuel heating the forge and beginning work on a set of horseshoes for Ezra Morrison's draft horses. The old farmer needed them before the autumn harvest, when every working animal in the valley would be pressed into service, bringing in the crops that would see them through another mountain winter. Samuel had always taken pride in his work, each shoe fitted precisely to the individual horse, each nail hole placed with the careful attention that separated true craftsmen from mere laborers. It was just past 10 when the sound of multiple horses broke the peaceful rhythm of his work. Samuel paused, hammer held mid-strike, as 6 men rode into the small square in front of his forge. Even without looking up, he could sense their purpose in the way their leather creaked and their horses stamped with the restlessness that came from hard riding and harder men. Tommy stopped pumping the bellows, his young face turning toward the doorway with the curiosity that hadn't yet learned caution. The man who swung down from the lead horse moved with the swagger of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. He was younger than Samuel by perhaps 20 years, with dark hair slicked back beneath a black hat and a mustache that did nothing to soften the cruel line of his mouth. His clothes spoke of money taken rather than earned, fine fabric and polished leather that contrasted sharply with the hard edges of his face. A pair of pearl-handled revolvers rode low on his hips, and the way his hand rested casually near the grip suggested a man comfortable with their weight. Samuel recognized the type immediately. Not a gunfighter in the classic sense, but something perhaps more dangerous, a man who had learned that violence backed by numbers could be more profitable than skill with a weapon. The 5 men who remained mounted formed a loose semicircle, their hands visible but ready, their eyes scanning the square with the automatic wariness of predators in unfamiliar territory. "Black Jack Morrison," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the forge fire. Samuel had heard the name spoken in hushed tones at the general store and the saloon, always followed by stories of businesses burned and people who had simply disappeared after refusing to pay for protection they hadn't requested. The bandit had been working his way through the smaller settlements in the territory, building a network of fear and tribute that stretched across 3 counties. "Good morning to you," Samuel said, setting his hammer aside and wiping his hands on his leather apron. His voice carried the careful politeness of a man who had learned that courtesy could sometimes defuse situations that might otherwise turn violent. He stepped to the doorway, positioning himself between the bandits and Tommy, though he made the movement seem casual rather than protective. Black Jack's smile held all the warmth of a snake preparing to strike. "Old man," he said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Nice little business you got here. Be a shame if something happened to it." Samuel's pale blue eyes, the color of winter ice, studied the younger man without apparent concern. I do honest work for honest pay, he replied. Don't have much trouble with folks around here. That's because you ain't been paying for protection, Black Jack continued, stepping closer to the forge entrance. Times are changing, old-timer. Lots of dangerous men in these mountains. Never know when someone might take it into their head to burn down a place like this. The threat hung in the air like smoke from the forge, and Samuel felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest. He had hoped those days were behind him, that he could live out his remaining years in peace, working with his hands to build rather than destroy. But some men, it seemed, could only understand the world through the lens of violence and intimidation. Tommy shifted nervously beside the bellows, his young face flushed with indignation at the casual arrogance of the bandits. Samuel caught his eye and gave the slightest shake of his head, a warning that the boy was smart enough to heed. This was not the time for heroics or hot words that might escalate a situation that could still, perhaps, be resolved without bloodshed. Don't need protection, Samuel said, his voice remaining calm and measured. Been taking care of myself for a long time now. Black Jack's laugh was sharp and unpleasant, and his men shifted in their saddles with the anticipation of violence barely held in check. You hear that, boys, he called to his companions. The old hammer swinger thinks he can take care of himself. Samuel felt his hands steady in a way they hadn't in years, the slight tremor of age disappearing as old instincts stirred beneath the carefully cultivated facade of peaceful retirement. His shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly, and for just a moment, the light in his eyes shifted from the mild patience of a craftsman to something far colder and infinitely more dangerous. Might be you want to think about finding some other place to conduct your business, Samuel said quietly. Iron Creek's a peaceful town. Folks here don't take kindly to trouble. Black Jack stepped even closer, near enough that Samuel could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the yellow stains on his teeth. The bandit's hand dropped to rest on his gun, but a gesture calculated to intimidate and cow potential resistance before it could form. Old man, Black Jack said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, you got two choices. You can pay me $50 a month for protection, or you can watch this place burn to the ground. What's it going to be? Samuel held Black Jack's stare for a long moment, the silence broken only by the crackling of the forge fire and the restless stamping of the bandits' horses. Finally, he stepped back into the forge, picked up his hammer, and returned to his work on the horseshoe, as if the conversation had never occurred. The rhythmic ringing of steel on steel resumed, each blow deliberate and measured, a sound that had echoed through these mountains for 15 years of peaceful mornings. Black Jack's face darkened with the kind of rage that came from being dismissed by someone he considered beneath his notice. He spat into the dirt beside Samuel's anvil and swung back onto his horse with violent grace. You got until tomorrow, old man, he snarled. Then we come back and collect what's owed, one way or another. The bandits rode out in a cloud of dust and harsh laughter. But Samuel noticed how Black Jack kept looking back over his shoulder, his jaw tight with the kind of wounded pride that festered overnight and returned with doubled venom. Tommy remained frozen by the bellows until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, then released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Master Samuel, the boy whispered, what are we going to do? Samuel set down his hammer and studied the horseshoe he had been working, turning the hot iron with a pair of tongs while he considered his options. We finish these shoes for Ezra, he said finally. Then we prepare for tomorrow. The rest of that day passed with deceptive quiet. Samuel completed his work with his usual methodical precision, but Tommy noticed subtle changes in his master's behavior. The older man moved through the forge with a different awareness, his eyes constantly checking the approaches to the building, his ears tuned to sounds from the street beyond. When Ezra Morrison came to collect his horseshoes that afternoon, Samuel walked outside with him, ostensibly to inspect the draft horse's hooves, but actually to survey the surrounding buildings and note which ones offered clear lines of sight to his forge. The next morning arrived gray and sullen, with low clouds promising rain before noon. Samuel arrived at the forge earlier than usual, and Tommy found him already at work when he stumbled and still rubbing sleep from his eyes. The older man had built up the fire higher than normal and arranged his tools with what seemed like extra care, each hammer and tong placed precisely within easy reach. Black Jack returned with 6 men instead of 5. The additional gunman, a lean scarecrow of a man with dead eyes and guns worn high on his hips in the manner of someone who favored the quick draw over practical accuracy. They rode directly to the forge entrance and dismounted without ceremony, their boots hitting the ground with the solid authority of men who expected immediate compliance. "Decision time, old man," Black Jack announced, striding into the forge without invitation. His men followed, spreading out to block the exits and creating a semicircle of threat around Samuel's workspace. "Hope you spent yesterday thinking about our conversation." Samuel continued working at his anvil, shaping what appeared to be a simple iron bar, though Tommy noticed his master's grip on the hammer had changed to something that looked less like craftsmanship and more like preparation for war. "I thought about it," Samuel replied without looking up. "Decided I like things the way they are." Black Jack's face flushed red above his mustache, and he reached out to sweep a collection of finished horseshoes off Samuel's workbench. The iron clanged against the stone floor of the forge, scattering across the space where Tommy had to skip backward to avoid being struck. "That was your mistake, Grandpa." The scarecrow gunman stepped forward and deliberately knocked over Samuel's tool rack, sending carefully maintained hammers and tongs clattering into the dirt. Another bandit kicked at the bucket of water Samuel used for cooling hot metal, sending it spinning across the floor in a spray of dirty water and ash. The systematic destruction continued as the men overturned his carefully organized workspace, years of patient arrangement destroyed in moments of spiteful violence. Tommy's face burned with indignation at seeing his master's life's work treated with such casual contempt. "Stop it," he shouted, stepping forward with the reckless courage of youth. "You got no right to destroy his things." Black Jack's backhanded blow sent the boy sprawling, his head striking the corner of the stone forge with a sound that made Samuel's hands go perfectly still on his hammer and iron. Tommy slumped to the ground, blood trickling from a cut above his ear, his eyes unfocused and blinking in confusion. The change in Samuel was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. His shoulders squared and straightened, shedding the careful stoop of apparent age like a snake shedding old skin. The slight tremor that had marked his hands for the past several years disappeared entirely, leaving them rock-steady and sure. His pale blue eyes swept across the forge, taking in positions and angles with the automatic precision of a man accustomed to making tactical assessments under pressure. "That boy is under my protection," Samuel said, and his voice had dropped to a tone like winter wind across mountain peaks, cold and carrying and absolutely without compromise. Black Jack laughed, but there was less conviction in it than there had been the day before. He had noticed something different about the old blacksmith, though he couldn't quite identify what had changed. "Your protection," he sneered. "What are you going to do about it, old-timer? Hit us with your little hammer?" Samuel set the hammer aside with deliberate care and stepped to where Tommy lay groaning softly against the forged stones. He helped the boy to his feet, checking the cut on his head with gentle fingers that nonetheless moved with the confident expertise of someone who had tended battlefield wounds. When he was satisfied that Tommy was not seriously injured, he guided the boy to a safe corner of the forge and turned back to face the bandits. Now, if you're watching this tale of hidden strength and unexpected courage, I hope you'll hit that like button and let me know in the comments where you're listening from around the world. These stories of ordinary people with extraordinary pasts reach viewers everywhere, and I love hearing how far they travel. Make sure you stay with me because what happens next will show you why you should never judge someone by their appearance alone. Samuel faced the 6 men with the calm assessment of a commander surveying a battlefield. His eyes cataloged details with military precision. Black Jack carried twin revolvers, but favored his right hand, evidenced by the extra wear on that holster. The scarecrow gunman's weapons were clean and well-maintained, marking him as a professional, but his stance suggested someone more comfortable shooting from ambush than face-to-face confrontation. 2 of the other men carried rifles across their saddle horns, lever-action Winchesters that would be deadly at distance, but cumbersome in the confined space of the forge. The remaining 2 bandits relied on handguns and knife work, their weapons chosen for intimidation rather than efficiency. Samuel noted the positions they had taken, how they had unconsciously left their horses blocking their own escape routes, and the way they kept glancing toward the street as if hoping for witnesses to their dominance rather than fearing intervention. "You boys made a mistake coming back here," Samuel said quietly. His voice carried a new authority that made even Black Jack hesitate, though the bandit leader couldn't identify why the old man suddenly seemed so much more dangerous than he had the day before. "The only mistake was yours," Black Jack blustered, but his hand had moved closer to his gun butt, and his men were shifting nervously behind him. "You had your chance to do this easy." Samuel stepped backward toward his anvil, his movement fluid and controlled in a way that suggested strength carefully hidden rather than age carefully managed. "There's still time for you to ride out of here," he said. "Take your men and find some other place to practice your business." Black Jack's face twisted with the kind of rage that came from being challenged by someone he had dismissed as harmless. "The hell with this," he snarled, his hand dropping toward his gun. "Burn this place down, boys. Time to teach this old fool some respect." But even as the words left his mouth, something in Samuel's bearing made him hesitate. The blacksmith stood differently now, balanced on the balls of his feet with his hands loose and ready at his sides. His eyes had taken on a quality that reminded Black Jack unpleasantly of winter storms and mountain predators, patient and cold and absolutely certain of their own deadly capabilities. The moment stretched between them like a wire drawn tight. 6 armed men facing one elderly blacksmith in the confined space of a mountain forge. Outside, the first drops of the promised rain began to patter against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour with solemn authority. "Tomorrow," Black Jack said finally, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Tomorrow we come back and finish this proper." As the bandits filed out of the forge, Samuel remained motionless until the sound of their horses faded into the mountain mist. Only then did he kneel beside Tommy, checking the boy's injury once more and helping him to a chair beside the forge fire. "Master Samuel," Tommy whispered, his voice shaky from more than just the blow he had received. "There was something different about you just then, something that scared them." Samuel returned to his anvil and picked up the iron bar he had been working, studying it in the firelight as if seeing it for the first time. "Sometimes, boy," he said softly, "a man has to remember things he'd rather forget." The third day dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that came after mountain storms, the air washed clean and sharp enough to cut. Samuel arrived at his forge before sunrise, and Tommy found him already deep in concentration over a project that seemed to consume his complete attention. The older man worked with an intensity the boy had never witnessed before, his hammer falling in precise, measured strokes against a piece of steel that gleamed with exceptional quality. "What are you making, Master Samuel?" Tommy asked, peering over his mentor's shoulder at the metal taking shape on the anvil. "Something I should have made years ago," Samuel replied, without pausing in his work. His voice carried a gravity that made Tommy step back and busy himself with preparing the day's materials, sensing that his master needed space for whatever memories were driving this sudden burst of creative fury. The steel Samuel worked was different from the rough iron they normally used for horseshoes and farm tools. This metal sang under his hammer with a pure, clear tone that spoke of exceptional quality and careful preparation. He had been working it since before dawn, heating and folding and hammering the carbon into perfect alignment, creating something that would hold an edge sharp enough to split silk and strong enough to turn aside lesser blades. Ezra Patterson hobbled into the forge around mid-morning, leaning heavily on his walking stick and moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose bones remembered too many winters. The old timer had been coming to Samuel's forge since the blacksmith first arrived in Iron Creek, and the two men had developed the kind of comfortable friendship that required few words and appreciated skilled craftsmanship. "Morning, Samuel," Ezra said, settling himself on a wooden crate near the forge fire with a grateful sigh. "Working mighty early today, ain't you?" Samuel nodded without looking up from his work, his concentration absolute as he shaped what was clearly becoming the blade of a sword. Ezra's rheumy eyes sharpened with interest as he watched the familiar motions of a master craftsman creating something far beyond the usual scope of frontier metalwork. "Been a long time since I seen anyone forge a blade like that," Ezra observed quietly. "Most folks nowadays buy their steel ready-made from back east." Samuel's hammer paused for just a moment before resuming its rhythm. "Sometimes a man needs to make something with his own hands," he replied. something that carries his mark and his meaning. Ezra studied the blacksmith's posture and technique with the careful attention of someone who had seen enough of the world to recognize excellence when it appeared. The way Samuel held himself over the anvil, the precise angle of his strikes, the confident manner in which he manipulated the red-hot steel, all spoke of training that went far beyond what any frontier blacksmith would need or possess. "That's military work," Ezra said softly, his voice carrying the certainty of personal experience. "Seen enough cavalry sabers in my day to know the forging. You got the hands of someone who learned that trade proper." Samuel's movements never faltered, but Tommy noticed a subtle tension in his master's shoulders, as if old memories were stirring like smoke from banked coals. 30 years I served," Samuel said finally, his voice pitched low enough that only Ezra and Tommy could hear. 23 major engagements. Forged blades for better men than walk these mountains today." The revelation hung in the air like the scent of hot steel and coal smoke, and Ezra leaned forward with the sudden alertness of a man who had just realized he was in the presence of something significant. Before he could ask more questions, the sound of approaching horses broke the morning stillness, and Samuel's hammer stopped mid-strike. Black Jack Morrison rode into the square with 7 men this time, their faces set with the grim determination of men who had come to finish unpleasant business. But these bandits carried more than guns and attitude. 2 of them bore torches already lit, the flames dancing in the clear mountain air like harbingers of destruction. Others carried canvas sacks that sloshed with the distinctive sound of coal oil, and their intent was written clearly in the cruel satisfaction on their faces. "Last chance, old man," Black Jack called as he dismounted with theatrical swagger. "Double payment now, or we burn you out and salt the ground where your forge stood." Samuel set his hammer aside with deliberate care and moved the partially completed blade to a position where the flames of the forge would keep it at working temperature. He stepped to the doorway of his workshop, and Ezra noticed that his bearing had changed completely from the stooped, aging craftsman who had been working just moments before. The blacksmith now stood with the straight-backed posture of a man accustomed to command, his shoulders squared and his hands held loose and ready at his sides. His pale blue eyes swept across the mounted bandits with the kind of tactical assessment that cataloged strengths, weaknesses, and potential lines of attack with automatic precision. Tommy moved closer to the forge fire, his young face tight with fear and determination. Ezra remained on his wooden crate, but shifted his weight in a way that suggested the old-timer might not be quite as frail as his walking stick implied. The moment stretched taut with the promise of violence. 7 armed men facing 1 blacksmith, 1 apprentice, and 1 elderly customer in the confined space around the forge. "Burn it," Black Jack ordered with vicious satisfaction. "All of it." The bandits moved with practiced efficiency, splashing coal oil across the exterior walls of the stone and timber building, while Samuel continued to work inside, as if nothing unusual was happening. The sharp smell of petroleum cut through the familiar sense of hot metal and coal smoke, and Tommy watched in horror as years of his master's careful construction was doused in preparation for destruction. Samuel never paused in his work, heating and hammering the blade with mechanical precision even as the sounds of preparation for arson continued around him. His movements had taken on an almost ritualistic quality, each strike of the hammer deliberate and meaningful, as if he were forging more than simple steel, as if he were calling up ghosts of battles and brotherhood that had shaped his hands decades before. "Light it up," Black Jack commanded, stepping back to appreciate the coming destruction. The torches touched the oil-soaked walls with a whoosh that sent flames racing around the building's perimeter. Within moments, the forge was surrounded by a curtain of fire that turned the morning air to dancing heat and filled the sky with thick black smoke. The bandits laughed and cheered as Samuel's life work began to burn, their voices crude and triumphant over the roar of the flames. But inside the forge, Samuel continued his work with unshakable concentration. The fire outside seemed to have no effect on his focus as he made the final adjustments to the blade he had been creating. Tommy watched in amazement as his master worked surrounded by smoke and heat, his movements sure and confident despite the chaos that threatened to engulf them all. When Samuel finally stepped back from his anvil, he held in his hands a cavalry saber of extraordinary beauty. The blade gleamed like captured sunlight, perfectly balanced and sharp enough to split a hair. The guard was forged in the classic pattern of military issue, functional rather than decorative, but possessed of an elegance that spoke to both form and deadly purpose. The grip was wrapped in leather that Samuel had somehow managed to prepare despite the morning's interruptions, and the pommel bore the simple but unmistakable mark of a master craftsman. Ezra's breath caught in his throat as recognition struck him like a physical blow. "Master Samuel," Tommy whispered, his voice filled with awe and dawning understanding. "That's a cavalry officer's blade." Samuel emerged from the smoke-filled interior of his burning forge like a figure from legend, the saber held with the casual competence of someone who had carried such weapons through years of warfare. The flames created a backdrop that turned him into something mythic, no longer the gentle blacksmith who had taught Tommy the secrets of working iron, but something far more dangerous and infinitely more certain of its own deadly capabilities. 30 years I served," Samuel said, his voice carrying clearly over the roar of the flames. "The Iron Mountain Cavalry. 23 battles from the Canadian border to the Rio Grande. I forged blades for colonels and generals, for men who died with honor and men who lived to build this territory into something worth protecting." The bandits stopped their celebration as Samuel stepped into the firelight, no longer stooped with age, but standing with the bearing of someone who had commanded troops in battle. The saber in his hands caught the light of the burning building and threw it back in patterns that seemed to dance with their own inner fire. Black Jack's face went pale as understanding began to penetrate his arrogance. The name Samuel Hartwell meant nothing to him, but the sight of a cavalry saber perfectly forged and held by hands that clearly knew its use struck some primitive chord of recognition and fear. "I retired these hands 15 years ago," Samuel continued, his voice calm and matter-of-fact despite the destruction that surrounded him. "Thought I was done with violence, done with the business of ending lives and breaking the things that evil men build. But some things you never forget, and some duties you never quite lay down." The flames behind him had begun to consume the wooden portions of the forge, sending showers of sparks into the morning sky and filling the air with the acrid smell of burning timber. But Samuel stood untouched by the heat, holding his newly forged blade with the confidence of someone who had spent 3 decades learning to make tools that could end human lives with surgical precision. "Master," Ezra breathed, his voice filled with wonder and sudden comprehension. "You're the Iron Mountain legend, the cavalry officer who cleared these peaks of raiders and made it safe for folks to settle." Samuel's smile held no warmth, only the cold satisfaction of someone who had rediscovered a purpose he thought he had abandoned forever. "Some legends," he said quietly, "never really die. They just go to ground and wait for someone foolish enough to wake them up." Samuel stepped fully into the firelight, the burning forge casting dancing shadows across his weathered face, while the cavalry saber balanced in his right hand with the perfect poise of someone who had carried such weapons through decades of warfare. The flames behind him created a backdrop that transformed the humble blacksmith into something mythic and terrible, no longer the gentle craftsman who had spent 15 years shoeing horses and mending plowshares, but a figure from the violent legends that had shaped this territory. The change in his bearing was complete and unmistakable. Gone was the careful stoop that had marked his shoulders, replaced by the straight-backed posture of a career military officer. His pale blue eyes, which had seemed mild and patient in the peaceful routine of his craft, now held the cold certainty of someone who had made life and death decisions in the heat of battle and lived with the consequences. The slight tremor that age had brought to his hands had vanished entirely, leaving them rock-steady and sure as they guided the blade through practiced movements that spoke of muscle memory carved deep by years of training. Ezra Patterson struggled to his feet from his wooden crate, his walking stick forgotten as recognition struck him with the force of physical blow. His voice cracked with emotion and disbelief as he pointed a gnarled finger at the figure before them. "That's Captain Samuel Hartwell," he shouted, his words carrying across the square with surprising strength. "The Iron Mountain Cavalry. Dear Lord in heaven, that's the saber saint of Shiloh himself." The name hit Black Jack Morrison like a slap across the face, draining the color from his features and leaving him staring in something approaching panic. Even in the lawless territories where he had built his reputation on fear and violence, certain names carried weight that transcended ordinary criminal swagger. The Iron Mountain Cavalry had become legend in these peaks, their commander a figure of such tactical brilliance and personal courage that Apache war chiefs had spoken his name with grudging respect around their council fires. Samuel's smile held no warmth, only the grim satisfaction of someone who had rediscovered a purpose he thought he had buried forever. 25 years ago, he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of an officer delivering a briefing, I led 4 companies of United States cavalry into these mountains. Apache raiders had been terrorizing settlements from here to the Colorado border, taking captives, burning homesteads, making it impossible for decent folks to build lives in this territory. As he spoke, the saber moved in his hands with casual expertise, the blade catching and reflecting the firelight in patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner life. Black Jack's men shifted nervously in their saddles, their earlier confidence evaporating as they began to understand that they had cornered something far more dangerous than an aging blacksmith. Took us 3 years to clear these peaks, Samuel continued, his pale eyes never leaving Black Jack's increasingly terrified face. Fought from the Sangre de Cristo Range to the Continental Divide. 23 major engagements, countless smaller actions. Lost good men, better men than any of you will ever be, but we finished what we started. Tommy watched in fascination as his master transformed before his eyes. The gentle teacher who had patiently shown him the secrets of working metal, revealing himself as someone who had commanded hundreds of soldiers through campaigns that had become the stuff of territorial legend. The boy had heard stories of the Iron Mountain Cavalry around campfires and in saloons, tales of impossible odds overcome through tactical brilliance, and the kind of personal courage that turned ordinary men into legends. Ezra's voice shook with remembered awe as he filled in details that Samuel's modesty had left unspoken. He trained half the cavalry officers in this territory, the old-timer said, men who went on to become colonels and generals, including Governor Morrison himself. They say he could read ground like other men read books, see through Apache tactics like they was written in plain English. The irony of the governor's surname was not lost on Black Jack, whose face had gone from pale to ashen gray as the full scope of his mistake became clear. Samuel Hartwell was not just a legendary military figure, but a man whose former students now held positions of significant power throughout the territorial government. The bandit leader began to understand that he had not merely threatened an old blacksmith, but had declared war on someone whose connections and reputation could mobilize significant resources against him. Samuel planted the point of the saber in the earth before him, his hand resting lightly on the pommel in a gesture that managed to be both casual and unmistakably threatening. 847 men under my direct command, he said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reciting statistics that held profound personal meaning. Fought alongside the best soldiers this territory ever produced, and buried too many of them in ground we took yard by bloody yard. The bandits' horses began to sense their riders' fear, dancing nervously and tossing their heads as the scent of smoke mixed with the more primitive smell of human terror. Black Jack's mount, a big bay stallion that had served him well in previous intimidation campaigns, shied sideways and had to be controlled with a heavy hand on the reins. Never lost a battle, Samuel continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the sudden stillness that had fallen over the square. Never left ground I was ordered to hold. Never failed to take an objective I was given. And never, ever, let anyone harm people under my protection. The weight of those words settled over the gathered men like a shroud, and even Black Jack's most hardened followers began to understand that they had stumbled into something far beyond their experience or capability. This was not some aging shopkeeper who could be bullied into submission, but a military legend whose reputation had been forged in fire and blood across some of the most dangerous territory on the continent. Tommy found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Master Samuel, how many men did you kill in all those battles? Samuel's eyes never left Black Jack's face as he answered, but his words were meant for all of them to hear and remember. 53 confirmed, he said quietly. Apache warriors, Mexican bandits, deserters turned outlaw. Every one of them died because they chose violence over reason, because they thought might made right, because they believed that decent folks would always back down when faced with superior numbers and cruel intentions. The number hung in the air like smoke from the still-burning forge, and Black Jack felt his confidence crumble entirely as he realized he was facing someone whose experience with violence dwarfed anything he had ever imagined. 53 men dead by sword and pistol, each death a calculated decision made in the heat of combat by someone who understood the mathematics of warfare with deadly precision. Black Jack's voice cracked when he finally managed to speak, his earlier swagger replaced by something approaching desperation. "Now wait just a minute, Captain. We didn't know who you were. This was just business, nothing personal." Samuel's laugh held all the warmth of winter wind across mountain peaks. "Personal," he repeated, his tone suggesting that the word held meanings Black Jack could never comprehend. "You made it personal when you struck that boy. Made it personal when you threatened to burn down what I built with these hands. Made it personal when you brought fire and terror to a place where people were just trying to live peaceful lives." Ezra stepped closer to Samuel's side, moving with surprising steadiness for someone who had seemed so frail just moments before. The old Demer's eyes held the gleam of someone who had just remembered that he too had once been young and dangerous. "Those of us who rode with you in the early days, Captain, we ain't forgot what you taught us about dealing with men like this." Samuel nodded slowly, acknowledgement passing between the two veterans like a signal understood only by those who had shared certain experiences. The bonds forged in military service never truly broke, and Ezra's presence reminded him that he was not entirely alone in this confrontation. Other men in Iron Creek had served under different flags and in different conflicts, but they would understand and support what needed to be done. The saber came up from the ground in a movement so fluid and practiced that it seemed almost casual, but Black Jack flinched as if he had been struck. Samuel held the blade before him with the relaxed competence of someone who had carried such weapons through years of active campaign, its edge gleaming with the perfection that only a master smith could achieve. "I retired these hands 15 years ago," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of profound personal decision. "Thought I was done with the business of ending lives, done with the mathematics of violence and the weight of command decisions. But some lessons are carved so deep they become part of who you are, and some duties you never quite lay down." Black Jack's men began to edge their horses backward, their earlier enthusiasm for destruction replaced by the primitive wisdom that warned of immediate and deadly danger. They were experienced enough in the ways of frontier violence to recognize when they had encountered something beyond their ability to handle, someone whose reputation had been earned through trials that made their own criminal careers seem like children's games. The power dynamic had reversed so completely that the air itself seemed to vibrate with potential violence. 7 armed bandits suddenly uncertain in the face of one man whose hands held more deadly experience than all of them combined. Samuel stood in the firelight like a figure from an older and more dangerous time, when honor and duty had been carved out of wilderness with blade and bullet, and men like him had written the territorial laws in blood and courage. "Tomorrow at dawn," Samuel said, his words carrying the finality of a military order, "you ride out of this territory and you never come back. You take your men and your protection racket and you find some other place to practice your business. Because if I see you again, if I hear that you've threatened or harmed anyone under my protection, I will hunt you down like the animals you are." The promise hung between them with the certainty of natural law, and Black Jack understood with perfect clarity that he was not being threatened, but informed of consequences that would follow his choices with mathematical precision. This was not bluster or intimidation, but the calm statement of someone who possessed both the will and the capability to make good on every word. Black Jack's hand dropped toward his gun, desperation overriding the wisdom that should have sent him fleeing into the mountains. But Samuel had been reading the signs of that movement for the past 30 seconds, watching the bandit leader's body language with the practiced eye of someone who had survived more gunfights than most men could imagine. The saber moved in a silver arc that seemed to flow like water, and the flat of the blade struck Black Jack's wrist with surgical precision, sending his half-drawn revolver spinning into the dirt. The bandit leader stumbled backward, clutching his numbed hand and staring in shock at the speed with which his weapon had been removed from play. Samuel had moved with the fluid grace of someone half his age, covering the distance between them in two swift steps that spoke of muscle memory carved deep by decades of cavalry charges and close-quarters combat. "Tommy," Samuel called without taking his eyes off the mounted bandits. "There's a Winchester behind the forge fire, wrapped in oilcloth. Fetch it and find yourself a position with clear lines of sight." The boy moved with alacrity born of complete trust in his master's judgment, retrieving the rifle with hands that shook only slightly as the magnitude of the situation settled over him. Samuel had been preparing for this confrontation from the moment the bandits first appeared, using his years of tactical experience to set up advantages that were only now becoming apparent. The forge fire itself had been built higher than usual, creating a wall of heat and light that forced the bandits to position themselves exactly where Samuel wanted them. The burning exterior walls provided additional illumination, while the smoke created a screen that partially concealed his own movements. Every detail had been planned with the methodical precision of a military engineer preparing for siege warfare. Blackjack's scarecrow gunman spurred his horse forward with a wild cry, his twin revolvers clearing leather with the speed that had made him valuable to the gang's operations. But Samuel had already noted the man's preference for intimidation over accuracy, and the blacksmith stepped inside the arc of the charging horse with a matador's timing that spoke of experience with mounted combat. The sabre's pommel struck the gunman's temple with controlled force, precisely calculated to render him unconscious without causing permanent damage. The bandit toppled from his saddle and hit the ground in a loose sprawl, his unfired weapons scattering across the packed earth of the square. Samuel caught the horse's bridle with his free hand, gentling the frightened animal with automatic competence while keeping his blade ready for the next assault. Two of the remaining bandits attempted the flanking maneuver that had worked for them in previous encounters, splitting apart to attack from opposite sides while their companions provided covering fire. But Samuel had anticipated this tactic as well, using the confined space around the forge to limit their room for maneuver while positioning Tommy's rifle coverage to eliminate their advantage of numbers. The first flanking rider found himself charging directly into the muzzle of Tommy's Winchester, the boy's aim steadied by his master's patient training and his own desperate courage. The bandit's horse shied violently at the sight of the rifle, sending its rider scrambling to maintain his seat, while his own weapon fired harmlessly into the air. Samuel used that moment of confusion to demonstrate the cavalry technique known as saber versus lance, a maneuver designed to deal with mounted opponents who relied on reach and momentum. He stepped inside the second flanker's guard with the flowing motion of someone who had practiced such exchanges until they became second nature, his blade deflecting the bandit's hasty pistol shot, while the saber's edge opened a shallow but painful cut across the man's gun arm. The wounded bandit dropped his weapon with a cry of pain and surprise, clutching his bleeding forearm, while his horse carried him in a panicked circle around the burning forge. Samuel followed the movement with his eyes, but did not pursue, his tactical mind already focused on the next phase of the engagement as the remaining bandits regrouped for a coordinated assault. Blackjack had recovered his dropped revolver and backed away to a position that offered better cover, his earlier swagger replaced by the desperate cunning of someone who had finally understood the true nature of his opponent. The three unwounded members of his gang spread out to create multiple angles of attack, their movements showing more discipline than they had displayed in their previous raids. "Smart boys," Samuel observed quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden lull between attacks. "Using proper fire and movement tactics. Someone taught you well." But even as he spoke, his hands were busy with preparations that the bandits could not see from their positions. The coal oil they had splashed on his forge walls was burning in patterns that Samuel had subtly guided during their distracted moments, creating areas of intense heat and blinding smoke that would channel their next assault exactly where he wanted it. Tommy had found a position behind the stone foundation of the forge that offered both protection and clear fields of fire, his rifle trained on the mounted bandits with the steady competence that his master's training had instilled. The boy's face was pale but determined, and Samuel felt a moment of fierce pride at the courage his young apprentice was displaying under pressure that would have broken men twice his age. The coordinated attack came with textbook precision, three mounted men charging from different angles, while Black Jack provided covering fire from his concealed position. It was the kind of tactic that had served them well against unprepared civilians, combining speed, numbers, and firepower in a way that usually overwhelmed resistance before it could organize effectively. But Samuel was neither unprepared nor overwhelmed. He moved through the charging bandits with the flowing grace of someone who had spent 3 decades learning to read the patterns of mounted combat. His saber work displaying the kind of technical excellence that came only from years of practice under the most demanding conditions possible. The first bandit's charge carried him directly into a classic cavalry parry that redirected his momentum while opening him to a pommel strike that dropped him unconscious from his saddle. The second found his horse's reins severed by a precise cut that sent the animal bolting in panic while its rider fought desperately to maintain his seat. The third managed to fire a shot that came close enough to part Samuel's hair, but the blacksmith's counterattack demonstrated why cavalry sabers had remained effective weapons even in an age of firearms. The blade's flat struck the bandit's wrist with enough force to break bones, while Samuel's free hand caught the man's belt and used his own momentum to drag him from the saddle. The bandit hit the ground hard and stayed there, gasping for breath while his broken wrist sent waves of agony through his entire arm. Black Jack emerged from cover with both guns drawn, his face twisted with the kind of desperate rage that came from watching careful plans dissolve into chaos. He advanced on Samuel with the determined stride of someone who had decided to end this confrontation through superior firepower, his twin revolvers weaving patterns designed to confuse and intimidate. But Samuel had faced such tactics many times before, in circumstances far more desperate than this mountain square with its burning forge and frightened bandits. He had stood against Apache war parties and Mexican irregulars, against deserters and claim jumpers, and every variety of frontier desperado, and his survival had depended on his ability to remain calm under pressure that would shatter ordinary men. The saber moved in Samuel's hands like an extension of his will, deflecting Black Jack's first shot with a blade angle that sent the bullet harming into the forge's stone wall. The bandit leader's second shot went wide as Samuel closed the distance between them with the economical movement of someone who understood that every step in combat was either an advantage gained or lost. Black Jack's third shot never fired at all, because Samuel's left hand had closed over the bandit's gun wrist with the crushing grip of someone whose hands had been strengthened by decades of working hot metal with heavy hammers. The revolver fell from nerveless fingers as Black Jack gasped in pain and surprise, his arrogance finally meeting the reality of superior skill applied with ruthless precision. The saber's point came to rest against Black Jack's throat, not quite breaking the skin, but close enough that the bandit could feel the razor sharpness of the edge. Samuel's pale blue eyes held no mercy, only the cold calculation of someone who had made similar decisions many times before and understood exactly what they meant. "Yield," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Yield, or die where you stand." Black Jack's surrender came out as a strangled whisper, his earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of immediate and deadly peril. Around the square, his remaining men sat their horses in stunned silence, none of them willing to risk drawing Samuel's attention while their leader remained under the saber's edge. Samuel stepped back but kept his blade ready, his eyes moving constantly to catalog threats and maintain awareness of the tactical situation. The engagement had lasted less than 5 minutes from first movement to final surrender, but those minutes had contained enough violence and precision to demonstrate conclusively that the legends surrounding the Iron Mountain Cavalry had been built on a foundation of genuine competence and deadly experience. Tommy emerged from his position behind the forge foundation, the Winchester still held ready but no longer needed as the immediate threat collapsed into defeated confusion. His young face showed a mixture of awe and concern as he looked at his master, seeing both the gentle teacher he had known and the legendary warrior who had just dismantled 7 armed men with surgical precision. "Master Samuel," the boy said quietly, his voice shaky with reaction to the violence he had just witnessed. "Are you hurt?" Samuel checked himself carefully before answering. Noting the minor cuts and burns he had accumulated during the fight, but finding nothing that would impair his effectiveness if further action became necessary. "No serious damage," he replied, though his voice carried the flat tone of someone who was struggling with the psychological cost of returning to old patterns of violence. The weight of those 5 minutes settled over him like a familiar but unwelcome cloak, bringing back memories of other battles and other men who had chosen to test their luck against his skill and experience. Each use of that deadly competence carried a price that could not be measured in mere physical terms, and Samuel felt the familiar ache of someone who had hoped never to pay that price again. He looked around the square at the scattered bandits, some unconscious, some nursing broken bones or cuts, all of them thoroughly beaten and demoralized. Tomorrow they would ride out of Iron Creek and spread word that the mountains were still protected by men who remembered how to fight. But tonight, Samuel would sit beside his burning forge and remember the weight of choices that had seemed so clear in the heat of action. The forge fire continued to burn behind them, consuming the wooden portions of the building that had been Samuel's home and workplace for 15 years. But the stone foundation remained solid, and the anvil that had shaped so many peaceful tools stood unmarked by the flames. Tomorrow, with the help of his neighbors and the boy who had stood beside him when violence came calling, he would begin the work of building again. The dawn light revealed the full extent of the damage to Samuel's forge, the wooden walls reduced to charred timber and ash, while the stone foundation stood defiant against the destruction that Black Jack's gang had intended to be complete. The anvil remained unmoved in its position, blackened by smoke but fundamentally unchanged, a symbol of permanence that would outlast the men who had tried to destroy what honest hands had built. Samuel sat on the stone steps of what had been his workshop, the cavalry saber laid across his knees while he watched the sun climb over the mountain peaks that had become his home. His hands, steady and sure during the violence of the previous day, now trembled slightly with the weight of memories that 15 years of peace had not erased. 54 confirmed kills now, he thought to himself, though Black Jack and his men had been spared through choice rather than necessity. Tommy approached with careful steps, carrying 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the cool mountain air. The boy had aged years in the space of a single day, his eyes holding a new understanding of the world's capacity for both violence and protection. He settled beside his master on the stone steps, offering 1 cup while keeping the other wrapped in hands that showed only minor tremors from their shared ordeal. "Master Samuel," Tommy said quietly, his voice carrying questions that he was still learning how to ask. "Yesterday, when you were fighting those men, you were someone else entirely. Someone I'd never seen before." Samuel accepted the coffee gratefully, using the familiar ritual of morning drink to ground himself in the present moment rather than the battlefield memories that threatened to overwhelm him. "That someone never really went away," he replied after a long silence. "I just buried him deep enough that I hoped he'd stay quiet. But some things you never completely forget, and some duties you never quite lay down." The sound of approaching wagons broke the morning stillness, and Samuel looked up to see a procession of Iron Creek citizens making their way toward the damaged forge. Ezra Patterson rode in the lead wagon, his walking stick forgotten as he directed the convoy with the authority of someone who had stepped back into a command role that fitted him like an old uniform. Behind him came every able-bodied man in the settlement, their wagons loaded with timber, stone, and tools. "Figured you might need some help rebuilding," Ezra called as the wagons drew to a halt in the square. "Got to thinking that a man who stood up for this town deserves better than to clean up the mess alone." Samuel rose from the steps, moved beyond words by the gesture of community support. These people had known him only as a quiet blacksmith who asked few questions and gave honest work for fair pay. But yesterday's violence had revealed something about him that changed how they saw both his past service and his present value to their shared future. The work began immediately, with practiced efficiency that spoke to the frontier necessity of mutual aid in times of crisis. The damaged timber was cleared away and sorted for salvage while measurements were taken for reconstruction that would make the forge stronger and more secure than it had been before. Samuel found himself directing the work with the same organizational skills he had once applied to military logistics, coordinating multiple work parties with an effectiveness that surprised even him. Mrs. Chun, the Chinese widow who ran the general store, arrived with a wagon full of supplies and a determination to ensure that everyone working on the reconstruction was properly fed. Her presence reminded Samuel of the village women who had followed military camps, providing essential services that made sustained operations possible. She had lost her husband to claim jumpers 3 years earlier, and Samuel's protection of Iron Creek resonated with her own experience of vulnerability in a dangerous world. As the day progressed, the conversation naturally turned to the events of the previous morning, with various townspeople offering their own perspectives on what they had witnessed. The speed and precision of Samuel's response to the bandit threat had impressed them, but it was his restraint and victory that earned their lasting respect. Blackjack's gang had been defeated and driven out rather than destroyed, demonstrating the discipline that separated a soldier from a killer. Marshal Williams arrived in the late afternoon, having ridden hard from the territorial capital after receiving word of the confrontation. Samuel knew the man by reputation as a former cavalry sergeant who had served under different commanders during the Apache campaigns. Their recognition of each other was immediate and wordless, the acknowledgement of shared experiences that required no explanation or justification. "Captain Hartwell," the marshal said, offering a salute that Samuel returned with automatic precision. "Been a long time since anyone's seen you in action. Territorial Governor sends his regards and his gratitude for dealing with the Morrison gang." "They were given a choice," Samuel replied, his tone suggesting that mercy had been offered despite the bandits' clear intent to destroy everything he had built. "They chose poorly, but they were allowed to ride out with their lives, and a lesson they won't soon forget." Marshal Williams nodded approvingly, understanding both the tactical wisdom and moral complexity of Samuel's decision. The Morrison gang had terrorized 3 counties, but their defeat by a single man would carry more weight than their deaths at the hands of a territorial posse. Word would spread that the mountains still held protectors who remembered how to fight, and other predators would choose easier prey. Weeks passed as the reconstruction continued, and the new forge began to take shape with improvements that reflected both practical experience and community input. The workshop was larger and better ventilated, with additional storage for the tools and materials that Samuel's expanding business would require. A small apartment above the main workspace provided living quarters that would allow him to remain close to his work while maintaining his independence. Tommy's education continued throughout the rebuilding process, but his curriculum now included lessons that went far beyond the technical aspects of metalworking. Samuel began teaching him about leadership and responsibility, about the weight of protective duty and the moral complexity of violence applied in defense of innocence. The boy proved to be an eager student, asking thoughtful questions about ethics and tactics that demonstrated his growing maturity. The new forge was completed just as winter began to settle over the mountains, its improved design incorporating lessons learned from years of experience and the recent assault by Blackjack's gang. Samuel held the dedication ceremony on a clear December morning, with the entire town gathered to witness the blessing of tools that would serve them through the years ahead. Father McKenna spoke words over the rebuilt workshop that emphasized themes of protection and service, of honest work performed with skilled hands for the benefit of the entire community. But it was Samuel himself who provided the most meaningful moment when he mounted his newly forged cavalry saber above the main workbench, a visible reminder that some duties transcended individual preferences and that protection often required the capacity for controlled violence. 6 months later, Tommy had developed into both a competent blacksmith and a young man of impressive moral character. His experience during the bandit attack had matured him in ways that mere age could never accomplish, teaching him about courage under pressure and the importance of standing with those who protected others. Samuel began training him in the fundamentals of self-defense, emphasizing that such skills were a responsibility rather than a privilege. The territorial legislature passed a resolution recognizing Samuel's service to the community, officially thanking him for his role in eliminating the Morrison gang threat. But the recognition that meant the most came from his neighbors, who had seen him transform from peaceful blacksmith to protective warrior and back again without losing sight of the values that made such protection necessary. 2 years after the confrontation, Samuel received a visit from Governor Morrison himself, a man who had served as a young lieutenant under Samuel's command during the final Apache campaigns. Their reunion was marked by mutual respect, and the shared understanding of men who had seen the territory grow from violent frontier to stable civilization through the application of principled force against those who threatened innocent people. The governor brought news that Black Jack Morrison had been captured in Arizona territory and sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison for crimes that included murder and armed robbery. His gang had scattered after their defeat in Iron Creek, with several members choosing to seek honest employment rather than risk another encounter with the kind of opposition Samuel represented. Tommy, now 19 and a master smith in his own right, had become something of a legend himself among the young men of Iron Creek. His story of standing beside the famous Captain Hartwell during the Forge battle had spread throughout the territory, earning him respect that went far beyond his technical skills with hammer and anvil. He had also been appointed as a deputy territorial marshal, combining his trade with law enforcement duties that kept him close to his mentor. Samuel continued his work at the Forge, now assisted by 2 additional apprentices whose families had moved to Iron Creek specifically to place their sons under his tutelage. His reputation as both craftsman and protector had attracted attention throughout the territory, and his workshop had become a gathering place for young men who wanted to learn not just metalworking, but the principles of service and courage that Samuel embodied. The cavalry saber remained mounted above his workbench, no longer hidden but openly displayed, as a reminder of the dual nature of his calling. Sometimes protection required the creation of tools that built civilization, and sometimes it demanded the willingness to use tools that could end threats to that civilization. Samuel had learned to live with both aspects of his service, understanding that true peace could only be maintained by those who possessed the strength to defend it. If you've enjoyed this tale of hidden courage and the strength that comes from protecting others, please take a moment to like this video and let me know in the comments where you're listening from around the world. These stories of ordinary people with extraordinary pasts resonate with viewers everywhere because they remind us that heroism often wears the face of quiet service rather than loud boasting. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate the values of duty, honor, and the willingness to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. Until next time, remember that the most important battles are often fought by those who never sought the fight but refused to back down when it came to them. On Samuel's 75th birthday, the town of Iron Creek dedicated a small park in his honor, with a bronze plaque that read simply, Captain Samuel Hartwell, United States Cavalry. Protector, teacher, friend. The ceremony was attended by territorial officials and military veterans from across the region. But Samuel found the greatest satisfaction in watching Tommy demonstrate his blacksmithing skills to a group of fascinated children who represented the next generation of Iron Creek citizens. That evening, as Samuel sat on his porch watching the sun set over the mountains he had helped to pacify decades earlier, he reflected on the strange turns that life could take. He had come to Iron Creek seeking only peace and anonymity, hoping to leave behind the violence that had marked his military career. But the attack on his forge had taught him that some duties never truly ended, that protection was not a single act, but a continuous commitment that might be called upon at any moment. The forge still operated every day, its anvil ringing with the sound of honest work that built rather than destroyed. But the cavalry saber remained in its place of honor, ready if ever again the peace of Iron Creek required the services of a man who had never forgotten how to fight for those who could not fight for themselves. Samuel Hartwell had learned to forge more than metal in his mountain workshop. He had forged a legacy of service that would endure long after his own hands had finally laid down their tools forever.